I sent my HOA a $28,000 bill. They refused to pay. That was the moment I realized I didn't need revenge. I only needed the law. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I read every one of them and truly appreciate you being here. Now, let me tell you how a simple unpaid bill turned into the day an entire HOA lost every legal right to the lake they thought they owned. I didn't raise my voice when they laughed at my $28,000 invoice. I just folded the certified mail receipt, slipped it back into my truck's center console, and drove home knowing they had just made the most expensive decision in the history of our neighborhood. 3 weeks later, the same people who mocked me were standing behind locked steel gates, staring across a lake they suddenly couldn't touch anymore. The sheriff looked at the paperwork, adjusted his glasses, and quietly told the HOA president, "Ma'am, this lake is no longer under your association's legal control." The silence that followed was louder than any argument we'd had during the previous year. If someone had told me 12 months earlier that a simple maintenance bill would end with an entire homeowners association losing access to the centerpiece of their community, I probably would have laughed too. But that's the funny thing about paperwork. It rarely looks dangerous until every signature is already in place. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 39 years old, a licensed civil engineer, and I grew up believing that water teaches the same lesson every single day. It always follows the rules, whether people respect those rules or not. My father used to tell me that while we stood beside the old spillway before sunrise, boots soaked with dew and the smell of wet cedar drifting across the shoreline. He built that small water control system decades ago with his own hands and enough engineering knowledge to make sure the lake stayed healthy through dry summers and heavy storms. By the time I was old enough to understand why he inspected every valve, every retaining wall, and every drainage channel, I already knew the difference between ownership and responsibility. Owning something was easy. Taking care of it every single season was the hard part. After college, I became a civil engineer specializing in water infrastructure, and eventually I inherited the property surrounding most of the shoreline after my father passed away. I never considered the lake a trophy. It wasn't there to impress anyone. It supplied irrigation to nearby landowners, supported local wildlife, controlled storm runoff, and gave neighborhood families a peaceful place to fish, paddle, or simply watch the sunset. I never charged anyone a dime because my father believed good neighbors were worth more than monthly fees. For years, that arrangement worked perfectly. Then Willow Creek Estates elected a new HOA president named Victoria Langford. She was polished, confident, and always dressed like every board meeting doubled as a real estate advertisement. She spoke about improving community standards, increasing property values, and creating opportunities for neighborhood growth. At first, most of us appreciated the enthusiasm. Fresh flowers appeared around the entrance. The clubhouse received new landscaping. Seasonal events became more organized. Nobody questioned her decisions because none of them seemed unreasonable. Looking back now, that's exactly how she gained everyone's trust. Little by little, she began referring to the lake as our community lake. Then the newsletters started calling it the association's greatest shared asset. Soon there were organized kayak mornings, fishing contests sponsored by local businesses, weekend concerts by the shoreline, and private events advertised using photographs of my family's lake as if it belonged to the HOA. Every flyer, every social media post, every promotional brochure used the same image of sunrise reflecting across the water that I had watched since childhood. I noticed another detail almost immediately. Attendance kept growing, but so did the maintenance costs. The docks needed repairs more often. The shoreline required additional cleanup after large events. Electrical usage at the pump station climbed month after month. My maintenance logs became thicker while the association's advertisements became brighter. Standing beside the water one cool October morning with the faint scent of fresh coffee drifting from my travel mug and the quiet hum of the circulation pumps echoing across the lake, I stared at another stack of invoices and finally realized something that changed everything. They loved calling it their lake. They just didn't love paying a single dollar to keep it alive. The first invoice I mailed to the Homeowners Association was not emotional. It was not inflated. It was not even surprising if you understood how water infrastructure actually works. Every line had a date, a receipt, and a photograph attached to it. Replacement bearings for the circulation pumps. Electrical costs for running the aeration system through an unusually hot summer. Shoreline stabilization after hundreds of extra visitors packed the banks during community festivals. Dock inspections required after commercial vendors tied heavy equipment to structures that were originally designed for neighborhood recreation, not constant business activity. Every dollar was documented because that was how my father had always done things. He believed records protected honest people. I believed him even more after becoming an engineer. Still, I knew exactly how the board meeting would unfold before I ever walked into the clubhouse. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with new carpet cleaner greeted me as I entered the building. Framed photographs of smiling families lined the hallway, almost every one of them featuring the lake sparkling behind them in the evening sun. Ironically, those pictures existed because my family had spent decades preserving that view. Victoria greeted everyone with the same polished smile she used whenever local reporters covered neighborhood events. She thanked volunteers, praised community growth, and proudly announced that property values had reached another record high. Then she noticed the envelope in my hand. Her smile tightened just enough for me to recognize the change. I waited until the financial discussion began before standing up. I calmly explained that the association had dramatically increased its use of the lake during the previous 12 months, and that maintenance expenses had risen accordingly. I slid printed copies of the invoice across the conference table. $28,000. Every page organized. Every receipt attached. Every calculation verified. Nobody even looked at the supporting documents before the comments started. One board member laughed quietly and asked whether I was trying to invoice the entire neighborhood for sunshine. Another joked that community spirit should not come with a maintenance fee. Victoria leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and thanked me for what she called my passionate presentation. Then she delivered the sentence that would eventually change everything. She said, "The association does not pay private citizens for maintaining community property." Community property. Those two words echoed inside my head long after the meeting ended. I did not argue. I simply asked one question. Can you show me the document transferring ownership or maintenance responsibility? She smiled politely and replied that everyone knew the lake belonged to the community because everyone had always used it. I nodded, collected my paperwork, and walked outside without another word. The crisp autumn air felt colder than it had when I arrived. Leaves drifted across the parking lot, while distant geese skimmed low over the water. I climbed into my truck, placed the rejected invoice on the passenger seat, and sat there for several minutes listening to the soft ticking of the cooling engine. My father used to say that assumptions become expensive when they replace documentation. At that moment, I realized the entire association had been operating on assumptions. Over the following weeks, I continued my normal routine. Every morning before sunrise, I inspected the spillway, checked the pump station, recorded water levels, and updated maintenance logs. Nothing about my work changed. The only difference was that I began documenting everything with even greater precision than before. Every event hosted beside the lake went into a separate notebook. Every temporary structure erected along the shoreline received a date and photograph. Every utility bill was scanned into digital archives. The association believed I was quietly accepting their decision. In reality, I was doing what engineers do best. I was collecting measurable facts instead of emotional opinions. Then one chilly Thursday afternoon, while organizing my father's original maintenance journals inside the old workshop behind the pump house, I found something I had not looked at in years. Tucked between faded inspection reports and hand-drawn elevation sketches rested a weathered leather folder with my father's handwriting across the front. For simple words stopped me in my tracks. Lake Management Agreement Original. The leather folder felt heavier than its few pages should have. Dust clung to the edges, and the familiar scent of old paper mixed with machine oil from my father's workshop instantly carried me back 20 years. I could almost hear him reminding me that every important agreement deserved two things: a signature and a safe place to survive long after the people who signed it were gone. I carefully unfolded the first page across the workbench beneath the yellow light hanging over my father's old vise. The title read exactly as I remembered: Lake Management Agreement. The document had been executed decades before Willow Creek Estates even existed. Back then, the surrounding land had been scattered ranch properties connected by gravel roads and handshake agreements between neighbors who depended on one another during droughts and heavy rain. As I continued reading, every paragraph answered a question that had bothered me since Victoria dismissed my invoice. The lake itself was never transferred to any future homeowners association. Instead, the agreement established something much more specific. My family retained exclusive responsibility for maintaining the water management system, while neighboring property owners and any future residential developments could receive recreational access only as long as maintenance obligations outlined in the agreement continued to be honored. I stopped reading for a moment and stared through the workshop window toward the calm water reflecting the late afternoon sun. The wind carried the gentle rustling of oak leaves across the shoreline, while the circulation pumps hummed with the steady rhythm I had heard since childhood. Suddenly, the entire situation looked different. This had never been about ownership in the way people casually used the word. It was about contractual rights, responsibilities, and continued compliance. The association had slowly convinced everyone that frequent use automatically created permanent control. The paperwork sitting in front of me said something entirely different. Before allowing myself to become excited, I did what every engineer should do when discovering an unexpected answer. I verified it. The following morning, I drove to the county records office just after it opened. The building smelled faintly of old books, fresh printer toner, and polished wood floors that had welcomed generations of surveyors, attorneys, and landowners. A clerk named Susan recognized my family name almost immediately. She smiled, disappeared into the archive room, and returned pushing a cart stacked with oversized record books and digitized property maps. For nearly 4 hours, we compared recorded easements, subdivision plats, maintenance covenants, and every amendment filed since the neighborhood had been developed. By lunchtime, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. Every developer who built Willow Creek Estates had acknowledged the original lake management agreement during the subdivision approval process. The references were buried inside engineering exhibits that almost nobody outside land development would ever bother reading. But they were there, properly recorded and legally preserved. I thanked Susan, ordered certified copies of every relevant document, and left carrying a folder that was much thicker than the one I had brought that morning. The cool winter air outside felt different now. It no longer carried frustration. It carried clarity. Even then, I refused to make assumptions. Instead of confronting Victoria, I scheduled a consultation with a property attorney who specialized in water rights and infrastructure agreements. His office overlooked the county courthouse, and the walls were covered with framed survey maps older than either of us. He spent nearly an hour reading every page without saying much. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he circled a paragraph with a pencil. Finally he closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and smiled in the calm way experienced attorneys do when the documents speak for themselves. He told me something I have never forgotten. He said, "Ethan, they are arguing about public perception. You are holding a recorded contract. Those are two very different things." I asked him whether I should file a lawsuit immediately. He shook his head. He explained that lawsuits should be the final tool, not the first one, especially when an agreement already provided a clear compliance process. If the association failed to meet its obligations after receiving proper notice, the agreement itself described exactly what happened next. There was no dramatic courtroom surprise waiting at the end of this story. There was simply a procedure that nobody on the board had apparently taken the time to read. As I walked back toward my truck with certified documents tucked securely beneath my arm, I realized Victoria had unknowingly built her entire strategy on confidence instead of verification. She believed repeating the same claim often enough would eventually make it true. Unfortunately for her, paper does not care how confident someone sounds. Paper only remembers what was actually signed. I followed my attorney's advice exactly because the fastest way to lose a strong legal position is to let pride outrun patience. The first certified notice went out the following Monday morning. It included the unpaid $28,000 invoice, copies of the original recorded agreement, certified excerpts from the county records, and a formal request that the association either reimburse the documented maintenance costs or explain, in writing, why it believed the agreement no longer applied. I was not trying to embarrass anyone. I was giving them every reasonable opportunity to fix the problem before it became something much larger. 30 days passed without a response. Not a letter, not a telephone call, not even an electronic mail acknowledging receipt. Instead, the association doubled down. Their monthly newsletter announced another expansion of community activities around the lake. They scheduled a spring fishing tournament, approved a food truck festival beside the shoreline, and even advertised private sunset receptions that homeowners could reserve for an additional fee. Every colorful flyer featured the same familiar view across the water, as if ownership could be established through graphic design instead of legal records. Every weekend brought more visitors, more temporary tents, more portable generators, more boats tied to docks my family still maintained, and more trash bags that I quietly hauled away before sunrise. The scent of charcoal grills drifted across the water almost every Saturday afternoon, while cheerful music echoed between the trees. Families were enjoying themselves, and I had no resentment toward them because they believed everything had been properly arranged. The problem was never the neighbors. The problem was the people collecting money while refusing to accept responsibility. My maintenance notebook continued growing thicker. I documented electrical usage at the pump station after every large event. I photographed shoreline erosion where heavy foot traffic had worn away the grass. I logged additional inspections required after temporary floating platforms were anchored near the spillway. Every page reinforced the same conclusion. Increased commercial style use created increased maintenance obligations, exactly as the original agreement anticipated decades earlier. One afternoon, I noticed a landscaping crew installing decorative wooden signs that read Willow Creek Community Lake at both public entrances. I parked my truck, walked over, and politely asked the foreman who had ordered the signs. He handed me a printed work order with the association's letterhead across the top. I thanked him, took several photographs, and wished the crew a safe afternoon. There was no reason to argue with people simply following instructions. That evening, I added the photographs to my growing evidence file. A few days later, Victoria approached me during one of the association's outdoor events. The smell of fresh popcorn filled the air while children laughed near the shoreline and neighbors gathered beneath strings of decorative lights. She smiled confidently and asked whether I had finally accepted that the lake belonged to everyone now. I smiled back just as politely and told her I had accepted only one thing. Paperwork always finishes conversations that opinions cannot. She laughed softly, told me I worried too much about old documents, and walked away before I could answer. Watching her greet residents with complete confidence, I realized she genuinely believed popularity could outweigh recorded agreements. She was not pretending anymore. She had convinced herself that enough repetition had transformed assumption into fact. The following week, my attorney received exactly what we had expected. The association's legal representative rejected the invoice in a brief letter claiming the lake functioned as a community amenity and therefore maintenance expenses were solely my personal responsibility. That single page mattered more than they realized because it formally documented their refusal to perform obligations described in the recorded agreement. My attorney read the letter once, placed it neatly on his desk, and quietly nodded. He reached into the folder containing the original contract, opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab, and slid it across the table toward me. The clause was unmistakably clear. If authorized users failed to satisfy documented maintenance obligations after proper written notice, their recreational access rights could be suspended until compliance was restored through the procedures outlined in the agreement. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time, letting every carefully chosen word settle into place. There was no dramatic hidden loophole and no clever trick. The procedure had been sitting inside county records for decades, waiting for the day someone ignored it. My attorney closed the folder and looked at me with the calm expression of someone who had seen this kind of mistake before. Now, he said, we stop arguing about the lake. We simply follow the agreement exactly as it was written. The next step looked almost disappointingly ordinary. There were no heated arguments, no dramatic confrontations, and no last-minute surprises. Just another certified envelope leaving the post office with tracking numbers, signatures, and delivery confirmation attached to every page. My attorney called it the notice of default. I called it the moment the clock officially started ticking. The document gave the association one final opportunity to satisfy its contractual obligations before recreational access rights would be suspended under the original lake management agreement. Every supporting record traveled with it. The unpaid $28,000 invoice, the previous correspondence, the county certified documents, the attorney's legal opinion. copies of maintenance logs, utility records, photographs. Even the rejection letter from the association's own attorney was included because it clearly confirmed they had knowingly refused to perform the obligations described in the recorded agreement. After mailing the notice, I went back to my normal routine as though nothing had changed. Every morning, I unlocked the pump station before sunrise. The cool air carried the scent of damp grass while mist drifted quietly across the surface of the lake. I checked water levels, inspected electrical panels, lubricated mechanical components, and updated another page in the maintenance journal my father had started decades earlier. The simple rhythm of that work reminded me why I had never wanted this dispute in the first place. My goal had never been to keep people away from the water. My goal was to make sure the lake survived for another generation. Meanwhile, the association behaved as though my notices had never existed. New advertisements appeared across neighborhood bulletin boards announcing an expanded summer calendar. A paddle race, outdoor movie nights, weekend yoga classes overlooking the shoreline. Local businesses even began sponsoring community events using photographs of the lake beside the association's logo. The more I watched, the clearer the pattern became. The lake was no longer being treated as shared neighborhood scenery. It had quietly become the centerpiece of the association's public image and one of its strongest selling points for attracting new homeowners. Every smiling family pictured beside the water represented another reminder that someone was benefiting from decades of maintenance they had repeatedly refused to support. A few neighbors eventually stopped me during my morning inspections. They were polite, curious, and genuinely confused. They asked whether the rumors about legal letters were true. I never criticized the association or spoke negatively about Victoria. I simply explained that there was a recorded agreement requiring certain responsibilities and that I hoped everything would be resolved professionally. Most people appreciated the calm explanation. Several admitted they had always assumed the association actually owned the lake because that was how it had been presented for years. None of them had ever seen the original documents. That realization stayed with me long after those conversations ended. Misinformation does not always begin with dishonesty. Sometimes it grows because nobody ever stops to verify what everyone else repeats. 3 weeks after the notice of default was delivered, my attorney received exactly 0 responses. The deadline expired without payment, without negotiation, and without any attempt to dispute the documents through the procedure outlined in the agreement. Instead, the association announced another large community celebration scheduled beside the shoreline for the following weekend. Victoria even appeared in a promotional video standing near one of the docks, inviting residents to enjoy what she proudly described as our beautiful community lake. Watching that video on my office computer, I noticed something almost ironic. Behind her, clearly visible for only a few seconds, stood the pump house that my family still owned, maintained, and insured. The building she unknowingly used as a backdrop represented the very agreement she had ignored. My attorney called later that afternoon. His voice remained calm, almost routine, as if we were discussing an engineering inspection instead of the conclusion of a year-long dispute. He confirmed that every contractual requirement had now been satisfied on our side. Notice had been properly served. Deadlines had expired. Obligations remained unfulfilled. There was only one procedural step left before the agreement automatically shifted from warning to enforcement. I looked through the workshop window toward the lake where the late afternoon sun reflected across perfectly still water. The gentle hum of the circulation pumps echoed through the trees exactly as it had every evening since I was a child. My father used to say that the strongest structures never announce when they are carrying weight. They simply keep doing their job until the day someone ignores the rules that keep everything standing. The following morning, I signed the final authorization that activated the suspension process exactly as the agreement had prescribed decades before. Nothing about it felt dramatic. It felt inevitable. Enforcement day arrived with the kind of quiet morning that usually promised nothing more exciting than another routine inspection. A thin layer of fog drifted across the lake while the smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the cool air. I unlocked the pump house, completed my equipment checks, and signed the maintenance log at exactly 7:32 in the morning. Then I drove to the county records office one final time, carrying a folder that represented nearly a year of patience. My attorney was already waiting in the conference room with certified copies arranged in perfect order across the table. Every requirement listed in the original agreement had now been satisfied. Every notice had been delivered. Every deadline had expired. Every refusal had been documented. There was nothing left to debate because the agreement itself described the next step with remarkable precision. Recreational access rights granted to participating users would be suspended until contractual obligations were fulfilled and formally restored. No lawsuit was required to activate that provision because every party had accepted those terms decades earlier when the subdivision was created. The county clerk carefully reviewed the documents before recording the enforcement notice exactly as prescribed. Watching the official stamp press into the paper felt strangely ordinary. There was no dramatic music, no celebration, and no applause. Just the sharp mechanical sound of government records being updated exactly the way they had been for generations. My attorney smiled and quietly said, "Congratulations. Everything from this point forward simply follows the agreement." On the drive home, I stopped by a local sign company that had already completed a project I requested several days earlier. The owner loaded 2 professionally printed aluminum signs into the bed of my truck along with mounting hardware and reflective posts. The wording had been reviewed by my attorney to ensure every sentence accurately reflected the recorded agreement. They did not threaten anyone or accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They simply stated that recreational access was temporarily suspended pending contractual compliance and directed visitors to contact the property manager for further information. Before noon, I installed one sign beside the main entrance road and another near the walking path leading toward the largest dock. The only sounds around me were the rhythmic tapping of my wrench against galvanized bolts and the distant calls of geese crossing overhead. A retired neighbor walking his dog paused long enough to read the notice twice. He looked at me with genuine surprise and asked whether this was real. I handed him a printed copy of the recorded enforcement notice. He adjusted his reading glasses, slowly nodded, and said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "I guess we all assumed the association owned this place." I smiled politely and answered, "A lot of people did." By early afternoon, my telephone started ringing. Some callers wanted clarification. Others simply wanted to know whether weekend activities would continue. I treated every conversation exactly the same way. I explained that the suspension was temporary, that it resulted from an existing recorded agreement, and that restoration remained completely possible once the documented maintenance obligations were satisfied. I never blamed the residents because they had relied on information provided by people they trusted. Around 3 o'clock, my electronic mail inbox filled with messages from vendors asking whether upcoming reservations should proceed. I forwarded every inquiry to the association because those contracts had never been mine to manage. The only responsibility I accepted was the one my family had carried for decades, protecting the lake according to the agreement my father had respected long before Willow Creek Estates existed. Late that afternoon, I noticed a familiar white sport utility vehicle pull into the parking area overlooking the shoreline. Victoria stepped out carrying a stack of papers, removed one of the notices from the information box mounted beside the sign, and read every line without speaking. Even from a distance, I could see the confidence gradually disappear from her posture. She looked toward the water, then toward the pump house, then back at the document in her hands as though expecting one of the paragraphs to change. It never did. Contracts rarely become emotional. They simply continue doing exactly what they were written to do. As the sun settled lower across the lake and golden reflections stretched across the perfectly still surface, I realized something my father had understood all along. Real authority does not come from speaking the loudest at a board meeting. It comes from quietly honoring responsibilities year after year until the paperwork is strong enough to speak for itself. Saturday morning arrived exactly the way the association had advertised it for weeks. Bright sunshine reflected across the water, the breeze carried the fresh scent of cut grass, and families began arriving with folding chairs, fishing poles, paddleboards, and picnic baskets expecting another perfect day beside the lake. I had no desire to ruin anyone's weekend. In fact, I arrived before sunrise to make certain everything remained clean, the shoreline was safe, and the pump system continued operating exactly as it should. The only visible difference was the pair of professionally installed gates standing open, but monitored by clearly posted notices explaining that recreational access had been temporarily suspended under the recorded lake management agreement until the outstanding contractual obligations were satisfied. Every notice included contact information for both my attorney and the association, so nobody would be left wondering where to direct questions. By 8:30, small groups of homeowners gathered near the entrance, reading every line carefully. Some looked confused. Others quietly took photographs with their phones. Several recognized me and walked over respectfully, asking what had happened. I handed each of them the same printed summary containing copies of the recorded agreement, the unpaid maintenance invoice, the notices that had been delivered, and the enforcement timeline. Nobody had to rely on rumors because the documents spoke for themselves. More than once I heard someone quietly say, "Why did the board never tell us any of this?" That question lingered in the air all morning. Around 9 o'clock, Victoria arrived with several board members walking quickly toward the entrance. Even from across the parking area, I could tell she expected this to be resolved with a simple conversation. She approached the gate, looked directly at me, and said the signs needed to come down immediately because they were disrupting an official community event. I calmly asked whether the association had completed the maintenance obligations described in the agreement. She answered by insisting the board did not recognize my authority to suspend access. I simply handed her another certified copy of the recorded enforcement notice. She barely glanced at it before telling one of the board members to continue preparing for the event. A few minutes later, a county deputy sheriff pulled into the parking lot after receiving calls from concerned residents asking for clarification. The deputy greeted everyone politely and requested copies of the relevant documents from both sides. Victoria confidently presented association newsletters, promotional materials, and board meeting minutes describing the lake as a community amenity. I provided the recorded agreement, the certified county filings, proof of every notice that had been delivered, the written refusal from the association's attorney, and the enforcement documents recorded earlier that week. The deputy spent nearly 20 minutes reading through everything while the growing crowd waited in complete silence. Even the usual sounds of weekend excitement seemed to disappear beneath the gentle hum of the pump station and the soft ripples touching the shoreline. Finally, the deputy closed the folder, removed his reading glasses, and spoke with the calm professionalism that comes from simply applying the law instead of personal opinion. He explained that recorded property agreements and legally perfected maintenance covenants remained enforceable unless modified or released through the proper legal process. Based upon the documents presented, the temporary suspension of recreational access had been carried out according to the recorded agreement. He then turned toward Victoria and respectfully advised that any disagreement should be addressed through legal channels rather than by ignoring the existing enforcement notice. For several long seconds, nobody said anything. The realization spread across the crowd, one conversation at a time. Homeowners were not angry because they could not reach the lake that morning. They were frustrated because they had never been told the association's right to use it depended upon responsibilities the board had repeatedly refused to honor. One elderly resident quietly walked over to me and said he remembered my father inspecting the spillway before most of the subdivision even existed. Another neighbor admitted she had paid association dues for years, believing part of that money supported lake maintenance. Others began asking board members where those funds had actually gone. Victoria looked around at the residents who had trusted her leadership, then back at the documents still resting on the deputy's patrol vehicle. For the first time since this dispute began, confidence no longer filled her voice. Paper had accomplished what months of arguments never could. It had replaced assumptions with facts, opinions with records, and confidence with accountability. Standing beside the water my father had spent a lifetime protecting, I finally understood why he always said the strongest foundations are the ones nobody notices until someone tries to ignore them. By Monday morning, the story had spread far beyond our neighborhood. Nobody was talking about a locked gate anymore. They were talking about the documents. Copies of the recorded agreement circulated among homeowners faster than any newsletter the association had ever published. Several residents stopped by the pump house simply to ask whether they could read the original records for themselves. I welcomed every one of them. The old wooden table inside my father's workshop became an unofficial reading room where neighbors quietly flipped through engineering drawings, maintenance logs, recorded easements, and county filings. The smell of aged paper mixed with fresh coffee while sunlight streamed through dusty windows exactly as it had when my father taught me to read property maps as a teenager. Nobody left angry. Most left surprised. The biggest question was always the same. Why were we never shown this before? I never answered for the association. I simply pointed to the dates, signatures, and recording stamps that had been sitting in public records for decades. Later that afternoon, the association's attorney contacted mine requesting an emergency meeting. We gathered inside a neutral conference room overlooking the county courthouse. Victoria arrived looking noticeably different from the confident board president who had dismissed my invoice months earlier. The polished smile was gone. Instead, she carried a binder filled with financial reports, board resolutions, and copies of community newsletters. After everyone sat down, my attorney calmly reviewed the timeline from beginning to end. The maintenance expenses had been documented. The invoice had been delivered. The association had refused payment. Formal notice had been served. The contractual deadline had expired. The suspension had been implemented exactly as the agreement required. Then he quietly slid one final document across the table. It contained an itemized accounting of every maintenance expense accumulated since the original invoice, including additional inspection costs created while the dispute continued. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody interrupted. The room remained almost perfectly silent except for the soft turning of pages. Victoria finally admitted that the board had relied on assumptions inherited from previous leadership rather than verifying the original development documents. She explained that each new board had simply repeated what the last board believed until nobody questioned it anymore. Hearing that, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because she admitted being wrong, but because the conversation had finally moved away from pride and toward facts. My attorney then proposed a straightforward resolution. The association would reimburse the documented maintenance expenses, recognize the recorded management agreement in writing, notify every homeowner about the actual legal status of the lake, and establish a permanent maintenance contribution so future costs would never become another point of conflict. In return, recreational access could be restored immediately after compliance was completed under the same agreement that had temporarily suspended it. The proposal was practical, transparent, and fair. Victoria asked for several hours to meet privately with the remaining board members. They returned just before sunset. Through the conference room windows, I could see warm golden light reflecting across the courthouse lawn, while distant church bells marked the passing hour. Victoria slowly placed a signed settlement agreement on the table. The association accepted responsibility for the unpaid maintenance costs. They agreed to reimburse the full amount together with the documented additional expenses incurred during the enforcement process. More importantly, they acknowledged in writing that access to the lake had always depended upon honoring the maintenance obligations recorded with the property decades earlier. As everyone signed the final pages, I looked down at my father's original agreement resting beside the new settlement. The old paper had yellowed with age. The fresh signatures were still drying in blue ink. Yet both documents served exactly the same purpose. They protected the lake by reminding every generation that privileges survive only when responsibilities are honored. The following morning's certified payment arrived exactly as promised. My attorney confirmed compliance had been completed, and together we prepared the final notice restoring recreational access according to the agreement. Standing once again beside the shoreline with the cool breeze moving gently across the water and the steady hum of the pumps echoing through the trees, I realized I had never taken anyone's lake away. I had simply followed the rules that had always governed it until everyone else finally chose to do the same. 1 week later, the gates stood open again. The new notices were smaller now, mounted neatly beside the entrance instead of blocking it. They welcomed residents back to the lake while reminding everyone that the shoreline, pump station, spillway, and maintenance system operated under the recorded lake management agreement that had protected this place for decades. The language was simple, respectful, and transparent. There was no legal drama left because there was no confusion left. The association published the agreement on its website, mailed copies to every homeowner, and held an open community meeting where residents could ask questions directly instead of relying on assumptions passed from one board to the next. I attended that meeting, but I spent most of the evening listening rather than speaking. Homeowners wanted to understand how something so important had remained hidden in plain sight for so many years. The answer was surprisingly simple. People had trusted summaries instead of reading original documents. They had accepted tradition instead of verification. They assumed someone else had already checked the facts. That lesson reached far beyond one neighborhood or one lake. It reminded every person in that room that rights and responsibilities usually live inside paperwork nobody thinks about until something goes wrong. Victoria addressed the community before the meeting ended. She acknowledged that the board had relied on incorrect assumptions and apologized for failing to verify the recorded agreements before making decisions that affected everyone. It was not an easy moment for her, but it was an important one. Accountability rarely changes the past, yet it can completely change what happens next. A new oversight committee was created to review every major contract connected to the association. Annual maintenance contributions were placed into a separate transparent account dedicated exclusively to lake preservation. Every expenditure would now be available for homeowners to review. Several residents even volunteered to help with shoreline cleanup days and environmental monitoring projects. Watching neighbors work together instead of arguing across meeting tables felt like the outcome my father would have appreciated most. As spring slowly turned into summer, the lake settled back into its familiar rhythm. Children laughed from the fishing dock after school. Kayaks glided quietly across the water in the evenings. Great blue herons returned to the reeds along the eastern shoreline. The circulation pumps continued their steady hum through warm afternoons, and every inspection I completed ended with another clean entry in the maintenance log that my father had started so many years earlier. Sometimes neighbors stopped by with coffee or simply waved while I checked equipment. They no longer saw the pump house as an old utility building hidden behind trees. They understood it was the quiet heart that kept the entire lake healthy. One Saturday morning, an elderly neighbor handed me a faded photograph she had found while cleaning out her attic. It showed my father standing beside the original spillway during construction nearly 40 years earlier. His work boots were covered in mud, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he was smiling at something outside the frame. On the back, she had written the date along with a short note thanking him for protecting the lake through floods and droughts alike. I placed that photograph inside the same leather folder that had changed everything. It belonged there beside the agreement because both represented promises kept across generations. Every so often, someone still jokes that I legally stole the lake. I always smile because the truth is much less dramatic. I never took anything that belonged to someone else. I simply enforced an agreement everyone had forgotten and reminded an entire community that privileges survive only when responsibilities are honored. The lake never changed owners. The paperwork never changed meaning. The only thing that changed was that people finally read what had always been there. Standing on the dock one quiet evening as the last light of the day painted the water gold, I listened to the gentle splash of small waves against the wooden pilings and breathed in the familiar scent of cedar, fresh water, and summer grass. I realized the greatest victory was never the $28,000, the settlement agreement, or the legal recognition of my family's rights. The real victory was watching a community rediscover trust through truth instead of assumption. My father used to tell me that water remembers every path it has ever carved, even when people forget. Looking across that peaceful lake, I finally understood exactly what he meant. Justice is not loud. It does not need to shout across a courtroom or a board meeting. Sometimes it arrives quietly inside a certified envelope, waits patiently inside an old leather folder, and changes everything the moment someone finally decides to read the page before signing the next one.